Let me introduce our initiative, UN75 Global Consultations, that is part of the national initiative started by the headquarters of the United Nations Association of the United States of America. And in turn, this national effort is part of the global effort started by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and is now conducted all around the world with thousands of dialogues. There are 2 points about global consultations in San Francisco that I would like to highlight. First of all, as President Steiner pointed out in her statement, there is a historic significance of the voices of the city of San Francisco. And second, we have been using a little bit different form of consultations in terms of process and format. This process is called World Cafe. So that is the process that we chose for our global consultations, and it combines the benefits of multiple perspectives of a large group of people and the intimacy of a small group conversation. People have an opportunity to work in different breakout groups on a sequence of questions that leads to generative, comprehensive summary of various perspectives. We also make sure that every single participant has a chance to point to critical points that might be missing in the final synthesis. We also employed a harvesting methodology or documenting methodology called collective narrative methodology. We have published our report. We call it Voices of San Francisco, Birthplace of the United Nations, and you can request that report on our website, una-sf.org/UN75-report. I encourage you to read that report, and we would be happy to share more of our methodology with those of you who are interested. We specifically would like the United Nations to look at this format because we think that is really can be replicated in different other areas of the world. For now, I'm going to read board resolution passed unanimously on June 21st, 2020 regarding global consultations. UNASF Board Resolution on the UN75 Global Consultations in San Francisco, unanimously approved by the Board of Directors of the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter and signed by President Mary Steiner on June 21st, 2020. Whereas the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter responded to the call of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and the Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the United States of America, Rachel Bowen Pittman, to participate in the largest ever global conversation on building the future we want. And whereas the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter reached out to over 20,000 San Franciscans through email blasts, social media advertising, and targeted outreach, selected 160 qualified delegates and hosted 8 UN75 global consultations in San Francisco with 135 highly engaged delegates representing government and civil society, including several civil society organizations that served as official consultants with the US delegation to the United Nations Conference on International Organization in 1945, indigenous peoples, business, the technology sector, and communities of wealth, homeless communities and frontline workers, healthcare communities, youth, young professionals, and other voices of people who live, work, or study in San Francisco or have been displaced from the city in the recent years. And whereas the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter used an innovative combination of World Cafe process and the collective narrative methodology, which proved to be a very effective method to engage delegates in generative conversations and collectively document a balanced overview of key ideas and recommendations that were shared or emerged in each consultation. And whereas the UN Global Consultations Committee of the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter analyzed collective narratives from the global consultations, submitted key recommendations to the United Nations and members of Congress through the National Office of the United Nations Association of the USA, and published all the collective narratives along with highlighted results of the data analysis in the report titled Voices of San Francisco, the Birthplace of the United Nations. And whereas delegates of the UN75 Global Consultations in San Francisco recognized the interconnectedness of all the issues facing humanity, along with the need to create a collaborative and multilateral world, address siloed government structures, increased hostility and polarization, structural racism, existential threats like climate change, and disparities with regard to access to education, healthcare, technology, housing, food, clean water, and other resources to avoid heading further towards a world defined by unilateralism, xenophobia. And whereas delegates appeals to our local, state, and national governments, among other actors, to do their part in addressing pressing systemic challenges. And whereas the collective narratives from the UN75 consultations in San Francisco present the United Nations as a trusted global actor that should play a stronger role by instituting enforceable regulations and holding governments, corporations, and other stakeholders accountable for their impact on our future, act as a facilitator of global conversations and transmitter of information related to critical global issues, administer help, and move resources globally. And whereas emphasizing the critical role of including people with lived experiences in decisions that affect them, our delegates called for the United Nations to build more effective partnerships for sustainable development goals and make the United Nations system more democratic, transparent, and accountable. Be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter recognizes and appreciates delegates of the UN75 Global Consultations in San Francisco for contributing with their perspectives. Our partners, the University of San Francisco, Urban Angels SF, and Innovation 4.4 for supporting the outreach efforts, and members of the UN Global Consultations Committee for organizing, facilitating, documenting, analyzing, and reporting of these consultations. And be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter urges the Office of Special Advisor to the Secretary General on the commemoration of the United Nations 75th anniversary, the Office of the President of the General Assembly, the United Nations Department of Global Communications, and other United Nations offices responsible for ensuring that diverse voices are heard at the historic negotiations that member states are conducting as they prepare for the 75th session of the General Assembly, to read the collective narratives from the UN75 Global Consultations in San Francisco. And be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter urges Senators Dianne Feinstein and Kamala Harris, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of San Francisco Mayor London Breed, and other political leaders who represent the people of San Francisco to read the collective narratives from the UN75 Global Consultations in San Francisco. And be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter commits to hearing and amplifying marginalized voices, such as voices calling for racial justice, gender equality, and indigenous rights. And be it resolved that as an immediate effect of this commitment, we are supporting the call of our least represented group, Indigenous peoples, for the United Nations to honor the treaties and other arrangements that were made between Indigenous peoples and nation states, to elevate the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples to a Convention of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to increase participation of Indigenous peoples in the General Assembly, and let Indigenous peoples have a more prominent presence in the United Nations system. And be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter urges the United Nations to continue its effort to find more effective ways to engage diverse voices, especially those of marginalized groups, young people, and grassroots organizations, and make these voices matter in high-level decision-making. And be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter urges the United States to pay our dues to the United Nations on time and in full. And be it resolved that the United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter urges the people of San Francisco and all peoples of the world to support the vital work of the United Nations and do their part of building the brighter future for all. Signed, Mary Steiner, President, United Nations Association of the USA San Francisco Chapter. And just really quickly, I want to thank all the members of the UN Global Consultations Committee. This committee has 22 people. So I want to recognize Jasmine Gauda, our Head of Communications and also Head of Communications Committee of UNSF, for managing our communications and also preparing the report as the editor of the report. Eleanor Nasander, Head of Data Visualization, so she was working on the graphs in the report. Dan Becker, Head of Engagement of Youth Consultation, and Michelle Sung, of course, and Bailey Walward as engagement team members for that consultation. And I was specifically mention that more than half of the delegates, the consultation came from Michelle's referrals. So Michelle is really outstanding. Then I want to recognize Holly Edson as Head of Engagement of the Global Consultation with Healthcare Communities in San Francisco, Elsie Galavish as head of engagement of the multi-stakeholder consultation, Denis Lemeshenko as head of engagement of UN75 global consultation with business, tech, and communities of wealth. Tracy Milligan was head of engagement for both homeless communities and frontline workers and the indigenous peoples. Then Swagata Sen was head of process of the consultation with young professionals and head of reporting for the consultation with healthcare communities. Agustina Singh was head of reporting of the global consultation with young professionals and the one with business, tech, and communities of wealth. Timia Sous, head of reporting for homeless communities and indigenous peoples and process team member for the young professionals. Tatiana Vekovicheva, head of reporting of the consultation with government and civil society and head of process for the consultation with business, tech, and communities of wealth. Maria Diana Velica, head of reporting of the consultation with youth in San Francisco and process team member of the young professionals consultation. Nelson Berry III, engagement team member of the homeless communities and frontline workers consultation. Lina Konstantinovich, engagement team member of global consultation with business, tech, and communities of wealth. Shout out to Nexus members. 3 Nexus members help us with the global consultations with business, tech, and communities of wealth. Process team member Axel Herrera, young professionals consultation. Srujana Kadavarmuth, process team member, young professionals. Larissa Mayer, engagement team member, healthcare. Keeley Mooneyhan, engagement team member, business, tech, and wealth. And that is it. As you can see, this is quite a team. And I would like to communicate my sincerest appreciation for everybody, all the partners, all the board members, the executive director of UNA USA, Rachel Bowman Pittman, and all the members of the committee for the support and the incredible work.